Well, good morning. I'm Rick. I lead the River Church, and this morning is really exciting because it is the end of our Acts series for this year. We're going to pick it up again in September, and I'm not going to give you much of an intro because if you were part of our preach last week, you'll know that this week I'm due to preach on 71 verses in the Bible. And someone once gave me some advice when prepping a sermon. He said, never read more than 20 verses and preach the rest. I'm flagrantly ignoring that today, so forgive me if this is a bit long. Doesn't mean I'm going to jump straight in. But what it does mean is that I'm not going to stand here and read 71 verses and then make a comment on it afterwards, because that would be long. I'm going to read it and make a comment, and read and make a comment. And some of it I'm just going to narrate us through instead of doing word for word. So all that to say, if you have a Bible, if you're watching on YouTube and you have a Bible, have it in front of you. And I'll try and shout out where we are at the time. But generally this is Acts 6, starting in verse 8, and then ending in Acts 8, verse 3. We are at the very end of the narrative of the church in Jerusalem, which is why we're going to finish here for this year. And if you're with me, Acts 8, we'll find a man called Stephen, who we met last week. He was one of 7 men chosen to serve Hellenist widows, which an act of social justice, making sure they had enough food. And then it says this about Stephen. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was doing great wonders and signs among the people. And you'll remember that these guys weren't picked necessarily because they had special gifting, but because they loved Jesus and because they were faithful to him. And wonders and signs weren't particularly a prerequisite of that role, but it's wonderful to see that God gifts the faithful. He doesn't necessarily use the gifted. And so Stephen's having a great time, but then a few men who are freedmen, apparently, they get up a bit of a hump about this, and they're cross with Stephen. And I want to pick out there that some of these men are from Cilicia. And I'm sure we've all been to Cilicia on our holidays, so it evokes great memories. But really, no, Cilicia is a place, obviously in the Middle East, but there's a city in it called Tarsus. And you may know the name Tarsus because a man called Saul, who's going to be quite a big deal in the rest of the book of Acts, is from a place called Tarsus. And right at the end of this passage, we're going to see that man Saul turn up. So we can assume then that he was there, and this is probably his account. And it's great to note that as this story actually paints Stephen in a pretty good light, and this is Saul's story, even when he was an enemy of Stephen, he could see that there was something good about him. And it says in verse 10, they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which Stephen was speaking. The gospel continues to confound at Pentecost. The Jerusalemites sneered at the untrained disciples from the north, but they were humbled as the Spirit cut to their heart through Peter's words. And so now, a Hellenist, a Greek-speaking Jew, a second-class Jew, if you like, is now unmatched in his wisdom. But it's not him, but it's the Spirit who is wise and unmatchable. And I've just realised I need to take my notes out of the Polly Pocket, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to see the next page. Okay. So they can't match him, so they resort instead to underhanded deeds. And they instigate men to speak bad things about him. And we will see throughout this passage there are parallels between Stephen and Jesus. And it starts here actually, because you think about the trial of Jesus, how the authorities had to raise false witnesses against him, and they had to be false because he'd done nothing to deserve death except declare the truth, much like Stephen. I particularly like Mark's gospel that says they got false witnesses, and those witnesses didn't even agree with each other, and yet they found it in their hearts to crucify Jesus. And their complaint, we read on, is that he's speaking against Moses, who is the Jews' great hero, They're speaking against the law that Moses wrote by God. And he's speaking against the temple, the place of the presence of God. Which he isn't, but it's important to note that. And gazing at him, it says in verse 15, all who sat in the council saw that his face was like the face of an angel. And chapter 7 verse 1 says, and the high priest said, are these things so? It's probably the same high priest who condemned Jesus. And instead of, jumping in and denying the accusations, what Stephen does is much smarter. This is what's called an apology, a defense of the gospel. Often when we're challenged on our faith, it's not great to just give straight answers and say, no, you're wrong on all these counts, because that just gets people's backs up. But instead, he meets them on common ground. And he says, okay, let's start with Abraham, right? The father of our faith. It doesn't matter if you're a Hebrew or a Hellenist, if you're a Jew, you are a son of Abraham, yeah? We're all on that page. And he repeats the story of Abraham. But he says that even though God promised Abraham a land to live in, Abraham didn't receive that promise. Stephen's building a sense of unfulfilled promise, which again is common ground for the Jews. And then Abraham, he made a covenant with God. He made an agreement with God. And it says he circumcised himself, which was then a physical sign of this covenant. And he did so to his son and his son after that. And again, he's meeting them on common ground. Look, we're the people of the circumcision, aren't we? We're the people with the sign of the covenant of God. But even in the Old Testament, the law that he's supposed to be refuting, it says there that actually the key to loving God, to loving his people, is not circumcision of body, but circumcision of heart. Being devoted to God, not physically, but spiritually. So having met them on solid ground, they move through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We get to the children of Jacob, who are called the patriarchs. We see in verse 9, it says, the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, one of the brothers, sold him into Egypt. You might be familiar with the story of Joseph. There's a very famous musical, Joseph and His Technicolor Dreamcoat, by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Many of you know I used to be an actor, and I actually worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber on a musical. I was doing a workshop. And one morning, we were in rehearsals, and the resident director got us all together, and he said, because we didn't see much of Andrew, he was mostly just writing music. He said, Andrew's rung to apologise this morning, because he hadn't finished some song or other we needed for the rehearsal. And someone in the cast said, what's he apologising for? And I was a bit cheekier in those days, and I said, Joseph. The resident director gave me a knowing look and said, it's a lovely musical. But there you go. So you may know this story, where he is sold into slavery by his brothers. And here we see the first in a repeating motif that will come throughout this preach, that the people of God always reject God's chosen ones, his anointed. And so Joseph is rejected by his brothers, and he ends up in jail. But then actually he is resurrected, if you like. It's a great picture of Jesus to greater glory than he had before, and great authority. And then there's a famine in the land in Egypt where he has this ruling position, and his own family, though they don't recognize him at the time, come and have to feed off of him. And then his father comes down, and so the whole of the people of God, the whole Israelite clan, come to Egypt and are saved by this Jesus-like figure. But they weren't buried there. They always knew they had this sense of promise. They were always going to go back to the promised land. And it finishes here by saying that Jacob was buried in Shechem, which was owned by Abraham. I always think Shechem sounds like a Scouser giving chess tips to his mate. Shechem, just you see his rook there, Shechem. Anyway, no. So having moved through all of these patriarchs, we get into Moses, what he's been accused of denying. And he starts by saying, as the time of the promise drew near, this is 17, as the time of the promise drew near. None of this had been fulfilled. We live with a sense of unfulfilled promise. And so, having put that in their mind, he reminds them that, actually, even though we were brought out of Egypt, even though we were given the law, we have still lived with a sense of unfulfilled promise. And so when he speaks about Moses, he paints him as Christ-shaped. He's shaded now, Moses, to look like Jesus. See that Moses was great, but he was never the fulfillment of the promise. Jesus was the one who would do that. And so Stephen paints Moses like that. And I'm going to read a bit now from verse 17. But as the time of promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose over Egypt another king who didn't know Joseph. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so they wouldn't be kept alive. Exposed, by the way, is kind of a nice way of saying expose them to the elements. And already we have a familiarity with Jesus. It's Christmas. We think about how Jesus was exposed to the elements because there was no room at the inn. His life too was sought by a murderous king. And actually, just as Moses will be in a minute, he found salvation among the Egyptians. Because at this time Moses was born, verse 20, and he was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. And when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. I mean, there's a whole gospel story there, isn't there? The one that was abandoned is now adopted and brought up as royalty. Anyway. And so Moses is brought up as a prince. I mean, he always knew that he was a Hebrew, he was an Israelite. And one day he went to walk and see some of his brothers who were in slavery, and he saw that one of them was being beaten up by an Egyptian. And so he killed the Egyptian. And he thinks, great, they're going to know that I've saved them. This is good. See Jesus here? Bringing freedom to his people. But what do they say? Verse 27, they say, but the man who was wronging his neighbour, they then got into another fight. The man who was wronging his neighbour thrust him aside, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Look for this phrase, thrust him aside again. The people of God reject God's chosen ones. Jesus told a story of a man who owned a vineyard. This is a made-up story, but it illustrated the point. A man who owned a vineyard, and he said, the man then let it out to some tenants. And the time came then for the tenants to pay their rent. And so he sent one of his servants and said, collect the rent for me. And the tenants killed that servant. Unsettling, so the landlord sends another servant. Come on, we've got to go collect the rent. And they kill that other servant. So finally the landlord then sends his own son. And they kill him. Stephen is painting a picture of how the people of God always reject God's servants, and lastly, his son. They've rejected Moses. Years past. These are the people they're claiming, he's speaking against Moses. He's like, no, you always rejected Moses. This is what you're like. And now you've rejected Jesus too, as judge and ruler of your lives. And then I'm going to read again verse 30. Now when 40 years had passed, when Moses had lived for 40 years in exile, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Sinai in the flame of a fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight, and as he drew near to look, there came the voice of the Lord. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. And Moses trembled and didn't dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their groanings, and I have come to deliver them. And now I will send you to Egypt. Egypt in this story personifies humanity's bondage of shame, of sin, and separation from God. And so Jesus, the new Moses, was sent right into the midst of it. Like Moses, sent from holy ground, the holiest ground, from heaven itself, at the word of God. His coming was announced by angels. And then we see verse 35. Stephen plainly casts Moses as Jesus. He says, this Moses whom you rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, this man God sent as both ruler and redeemer, like Jesus, by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out, performing signs and wonders in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. Jesus is ruler and redeemer. Jesus performed wonders. Jesus brought salvation, and Jesus was promised 1500 years previous to this event. Written by Moses' own hand in Deuteronomy just before he died. Stephen is not preaching against Moses. He's not preaching against the law. He's saying, you and I agree on this. The Christ is coming, and it is Jesus. The time of the promise was coming, and in Acts it had come. And then he tells the story of what happens next. They're in the wilderness. That's where they receive a lot of the law. And what happens? Our fathers refused to obey him, this is Moses, and thrust him aside. And in their hearts, they turn to Egypt. Again and again, they reject God's servants. And actually, ultimately, they reject God. Because he tells the story of when they're in the desert, and then Moses goes and receives. Moses is in the business of receiving the law from God, and what do? We don't know where he's gone, let's make a new God. Who's got gold? Let's melt it all down, and then make a calf. By the way, if you ever read that Exodus story, I love it. I love it because Moses comes back down and says, Aaron, what were you doing? He's like, we put in the gold, and out came this calf. No one molded it, it was magic, it just happened. That's the worst defense I've ever heard. But they turned to a false god. Having rejected God's servant, they have rejected God. And Stephen finishes this passage, verse 43, by saying it's because of this that God took you into exile in Babylon. Now, a quick history lesson for Israel. 1500 years ago, they were in the wilderness. And they lived then in the promised land for 1,000 years after that. But 500 years before this event, they were taken into exile because they turned away from God. And Stephen is saying, look, that happened because you've always been like this. You've always turned this against God's servants and turned them against God. But then he changes tack. And having proved that he's not anti-Moses, he's not anti-law, he shows that he's not anti-temple either. He says, because in the wilderness, our fathers had the tent of meeting, in verse 44, which is the place where God was, where God dwelt. And I mean, that's already a sucker punch to the Jews who think that, the place you meet God is in this static temple. No, it was always on the move. And so it was, verse 45, until the days of David, who found favour in the sight of God and asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. It was David's idea. Hey God, why don't I give you a house? God's like, I don't really need one, but okay, your son can build that for you. But what did he say to David? He said, no, instead of you building me a house, I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to build you a household. I'm going to build you a dynasty. Stephen's not saying the temple is a bad thing. He's saying rather it was pointing to Jesus. Because Jesus was David's heir. Jesus was David's bloodline. Jesus, Emmanuel, we celebrate it again this time of the year, which means God with us, the very presence of God. That's what the tabernacle, the tent, the temple, they were all pointing to. And then Jesus becomes the cornerstone that was rejected, it says in Psalms. The cornerstone upon which the church is built. The new presence of God. Just like a tent, movable, expandable across all the earth. He's not against the temple, Stephen. But now that Christ has come and the church is founded, we don't need to go to this building to meet with him. Because God has fulfilled his promise to David and built Jesus an eternal household. So having defended himself, 50 verses later, Stephen then goes on the attack. Verse 51. You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. He labels them un-Jewish, uncircumcised, because they haven't received God, his Son, or his Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. Now when they heard these things, they were enraged, and they ground their teeth at him. But he, full of the Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, Behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. God's people have rejected the latest of God's servants. They stop their ears as they reject God. And then we see again the familiar story between Jesus and Stephen, as they cast him out of the city in verse 58 and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Like Jesus at the cross, saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now the wording is right to be changed because it's by Jesus that we come to the Father. And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Again, echoing Jesus. Filled with his Spirit, he displays Jesus' mercy to his murderers. Echoing Jesus' words from the cross, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And when he said this, he fell asleep, which is physically dead, but spiritually resurrected. Sat now with Jesus, whom he'd seen in heaven. Which is where we saw Jesus ascend to at the beginning of this Acts series, in chapter 1. And actually that's why we're finishing this here, in remembrance of chapter 1. Because in chapter 1, Jesus, who was crucified, is risen, is ascended, and now commissioned his church to tell the good news to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And we just finish by looking at 8 verses 1 to 3, which says that Saul approved of his execution, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. And we have to remember this story in light of verse 1. Jesus is risen. Jesus is ascended, and Jesus commissions his church to go to the ends of the earth. And all term we've been looking at the story of the Jerusalem church. We've seen it grow. And ultimately it ends in rejection. The people of God turn away from Jesus, turn away from his servants who he sent them to. And this is really difficult for us to get into. It's really difficult for us to get hold of. We go, well, what does this say to us? Well, actually, I don't think it's too different for us. Because we live in a post-Christian society. We live in an environment a bit like Stephen was speaking to the Jews. He spoke to people who thought they knew the stories of God, who thought they knew God, in fact. And ultimately, when he came, they rejected him. We live in a post-Christian society that thinks it kind of knows God, kind of knows what Christianity is about, and yet, when they're confronted with Jesus and his resurrection, they reject him. Which can feel quite demoralizing. But then what happens next? They're persecuted and they're scattered. This is the bum 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 moment for next year. And we're going to find out what happened to them. We're going to find out what happened to that nefarious Saul character too. This year we've faced a persecution of sorts. Not necessarily by people who reject our faith, but by, demonic enemy, sickness, forces, fallen forces. And we're going to face hard times again. And that can be demoralizing too. But I think this is a challenge to us to be attentive to those to whom we're scattered. To maybe not go to the people who we expect to receive the truth. The religious, the post-Christian, the educated. Rather go to people who've never heard this before. And increasingly that is people who used to be Christians in our society. We've got to go to the people to whom we're scattered. Because Jesus wants to build his church there too. I believe there are people in Newcastle who don't know Jesus, but will. I believe there are people in Newcastle who have never ever heard this stuff before. Even if they've been brought up in a Christian school or whatever it is. And I believe we are being sent there through the scattering of COVID. We've ended up meeting neighbours and colleagues or whoever that we never would have done before. And that will happen again. Jesus will build his church. He will build his church. And that's how we finish this year. That's how we finish this series. Knowing that Christ is crucified, knowing that he is risen, knowing that he's ascended and that he's going to build his church just as he did then, and so he will today. Amen.